streaming.
Hello and welcome to Kathryn Arctic Live. We're here at the UK Arctic Research Station in Ny-Ålesund on Svalbard. And that's a small island, well not that small, between the top of Norway and the North Pole. So out of the door here, a little bit of Svalbard left, and then open ocean and sea ice all the way to the North Pole. Delighted to be joined today by Dr. Kathryn Smith, who will be talking to us about her life and research, and also taking some of your questions, both those that have been pre-submitted and those coming up on the live chat. Wonderful to have so many schools subscribe to this session. We've got them from the UK, Romania, Portugal, Sri Lanka, China, Nigeria, Albania, the Netherlands, India and Russia. So that's absolutely fantastic. Truly global. But before we start, it would be wonderful just to get an idea about your science career and some of the things that you've been up to. So you're currently a research fellow, is that?
That's
right?
great. First of all, hello world. Great to speak to so many people from so many countries.
Yeah.
Exciting. Yes, that's right. I am currently a research fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK.
And what does a research fellow mean? Does that mean that you've done doctorates and postgraduate degrees, or what level is that?
So that means I have completed my PhD and I have now managed to apply for my own funding. So someone's given me some money to go and do my own research, essentially. Amazing. So yeah.
And what is that research on at the moment?
At the moment, I am studying how climate change and ocean acidification, so how temperature change and carbon dioxide change around the world is impacting marine creatures.
Wow, so we did some live investigations on ocean acidification earlier, and so we're looking at both the process, so I mean that's carbon dioxide is the other climate problem. What is ocean acidification? Ocean
acidification, so it's essentially, there's lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the levels of carbon dioxide are increasing through lots of industrial activity and lots of different things that the Western world is primarily contributing to. And that carbon dioxide then gets absorbed into the ocean and turned into carbonic acid, which makes the ocean a bit more acidic and a bit harder for animals to live in.
And when you say harder for animals to live in, we've dissolved a bit of chalk and some vinegar, which probably isn't what's happening in the ocean. But how does it make it harder for the animals that live in the ocean?
That is a great question. It varies animal by animal, and to be honest, we're still seeing lots of different results depending on the animal. But the main problem that we are beginning to see, and that we think we'll see more and more of in the future, is that animals that build shells, so they have any calcium around their body or in their body, are struggling to form that calcium, because the more carbon dioxide that goes into the water, the harder it is for them to be able to build calcium around their body. So things like snails and crabs, animals like that, are going to struggle more and more to build their hard shell that goes around their body.
And we're up here in the Arctic studying these issues. Why is it especially important to come to the Arctic to look at ocean acidification?
Well, the Arctic in particular is a really interesting area because at really low temperatures, which is exactly what we've got outside here, the carbon dioxide gets absorbed into the ocean at a much more rapid rate. So ocean acidification is occurring at a faster rate here. The oceans are becoming more acidic more rapidly up here in the Arctic than they are, say, around the UK or around tropical shores.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, that's given us a really good sort of current picture of what you're working on. But really interested also is how did you come to working in the Arctic? What initially inspired you to follow a career in marine science?
Another great question there. My first sort of insight into marine science was back when I was a kid, probably at secondary school, actually around the age of the kids listening right now. And there was a guy in my village who was a bit of a polar explorer. He worked for the British Antarctic Survey, and he used to go down to the Antarctic all the time and do all this research. And he'd sometimes come round for dinner to see my parents, and he'd tell us all these great stories about all the things he'd been up to. And the main thing he researched was penguins. So while I was doing my GCSEs, I needed to do a project on something to do with biology, and I decided I was going to do a project on penguins. And I went round to see Bernard and spent loads of time going through his whole library of penguin information, and got really inspired through that. So that was my intro into polar biology.
Brilliant. And then from there you went on to study science or marine science at university?
I did. I went to Plymouth to study marine biology and coastal ecology. And then I spent quite a lot of time working overseas. So I went to the Caribbean and I spent a bit of time diving on coral reefs and looking at cruise ship damage to the coral reefs. And I worked in Costa Rica in a nature reserve where we were building artificial reefs to try and see how that affected the fish life there. Mm-hmm. And then I came back to the UK and did a master's in oceanography. And then from there, did some marine surveying around the UK shores, and then went on to do my PhD. I realised that I really like question-driven science. I was really interested in trying to find out what was going on out there in the world and how we could go out and answer these questions. So yeah, I went on to do a PhD. And that took me to where I am now. A quick postdoc in Florida before Exeter. But,
very nice,
yeah.
Very nice. And this is not your first time in the polar regions?
No, that's right. I've had a bit of fun up north in the Arctic and down south in the Antarctic. So I've done one research cruise, so come up to the Arctic by boat. We have about 100-metre research vessels that we take up out into the ocean to do research. And I've also spent 2 seasons down south doing research cruises down to the Antarctic, where we again take boats from Chile, South America, down to the Antarctic, land at the bases down there a little bit, but mainly spend time at sea doing research in the water around.
Those cruises, did you have a particular research focus when you were in the Antarctic and up here in the Arctic?
Yes, we did. The cruise I did up to the Arctic was with a group of scientists from America, from Woods Hole, up in Massachusetts. And there we were looking at how the different temperatures and currents changed in the ocean. So that wasn't directly related to my research. I was helping somebody else out with that one. The research down in the Antarctic, we were looking at king crabs, which are invasive down in the area down there. And we were trying to map where the king crabs were and how climate change is allowing them to approach further and further south down to areas they've not been in before.
Amazing. And thank you very much. We're going to switch to some of the questions that are coming through.
Sure.
We've got some great questions that have been pre-submitted, and then we've got some coming up here from Sri Lanka, from the WISE International School in Sri Lanka. But just to scroll back through, so William Borlas's grammar school in Marlow, they're quite interested in this idea of a research station and how we get our power up here and why we need power.
Well, we have a huge amount of equipment that needs powering up here, as well as keeping buildings warm so the scientists are safe. We've got lots of radio equipment that needs powering. We use boats out in the water and lots of other vehicles that all need power to enable us to do our research. And we get, I think everything up here is diesel powered, is that right?
That's yes. Correct, yes. And strangely, we also have a freezer in the Arctic.
We do, yes. So even though it is freezing cold outside, once we go and get our samples, we have to store them at specific temperatures. So we have one freezer at -20, and there's another freezer that's at -80 degrees Celsius, because sometimes some of our samples need freezing really, really cold to preserve stuff.
And it feels a little bit ironic that we've got this diesel power when we're talking to young people and we are doing research on the impacts of CO2 in the atmosphere, of climate change and ocean acidification. Why is it that we're not using sort of solar panels up here?
That would be fantastic to be able to use solar panels or other sustainable forms of energy. But unfortunately up here, right now we're in 24 hours daylight, so solar panels might work, although I'm not sure if they're temperature limited. I'm not sure if there's a low temperature limit.
Wow, we're being buzzed by what looks like a Coast Guard plane that is flying very low over the fjord at the moment. So if there's any propeller noises in the background, we're being buzzed by a Coast Guard plane with just disappeared. And, oh, it's coming round again.
Round it comes.
So that what we might do, if it comes in good view out of the window, it's sort of not too bad actually. It's quite exciting. What we'll try and do, Ellie, if it's not too, having said we're not going to go outside because it's fairly horrible, you try and get outside just to give you a sense of what's happening. We might be able to catch a Coast Guard flyby. Yeah, we're going to get slightly, we're not allowed to wear boots inside, so just to show you this, Katie and I are going to get very, very soggy feet.
Yes, we are, but that's okay, we can handle that.
We've got it, actually, just a beautiful view, just to give you a sense of where we are. So this is, Katie, if you want to come up here, just to show you, this is where you've been sampling.
This is indeed, yeah. So we've got the fjord coming along behind us. Out that way is the open ocean, and out this way we've got some glaciers feeding onto the fjord. So we have been going to either end, both ways, to collect samples for ocean acidification and to try and understand the microplastics that might be up here. So yeah, just a couple of days ago we were right at the very end of the fjord, in amongst the icebergs and lots of ice shelves, seeing seals and walruses on the ice.
Amazing. Wonderful. And just to talk a little bit more about ocean acidification, because we're away from our live chat, hoping for a flyby.
Yes.
Coast Guard, getting slightly soggy feet. We've got changes in pH in this fjord, don't we? How does that happen?
A lot of the changes we've got here in the fjord is because we've got a real freshwater influence at the top. So as the glaciers are melting, there's fresh water being added to the fjord, which is mixing and reducing the pH a little bit.
Okay, and does that affect the animals here at all, having that mix?
No, a lot of the animals right now at this point are designed to handle the mix. They've been living here for a long time. We do see differences season by season, or as the season changes throughout the year, you'll see differences in the amount of animals that are up here. But as we're speaking right now, a lot of these are built to handle the conditions.
Well, it seems like the Coast Guard or the naval plane has disappeared over that way. So it's great to come out and try and spot it. If there seems to be another sort of buzzing sound or sort of aeroplane sound in the distance, we might just nip out again, because I think that'd be rather fun.
Yes.
For our
to see them fly
audience to see. Be careful not to trip over our wires and just get the door shut. It's not the warmest place. Or the nicest place to stand in socks. The top survival tip: don't stand in socks outside in the Arctic.
That's right, in the snow.
Yes. So we've looked a little bit about that sustainability and the irony of needing that constant and reliable source of power up here, and the tough conditions that mean, you know, having solar power or wind power isn't really that easy. No,
unfortunately, those kind of sustainable sources of energy aren't perfect enough that we can guarantee they will always work up here to the level that we need. So assuming we go into darkness, which happens for about 4 months of the year, I think, here, it's constant darkness. If that should happen and we've got solar panels we're relying on, then the power will go out, the buildings will get cold, the freezers will get warmer than they are, and we'll lose our samples, and people will have difficulty surviving in the temperatures.
So on the flip side of that, I think we find here in this community is that there are constant reminders everywhere to really reduce unnecessary use of electricity, reduce unnecessary use of water. You know, we're limited. We have, you know, very lucky to have a sort of water from the glacier that comes out, you know, right, unfrozen, and there's something like 23 or 26 different categories of rubbish that we're sorting everything into.
The recycling is above and beyond the best I've ever seen in the world here. So
doing what we can to reduce our environmental footprint, but the necessities of science, meaning that we do need that constant and reliable source of power.
Exactly.
Going now to the Avenor School in Bucharest. It's quite a broad question. So it's, in what ways do you think global warming has affected different species of Arctic animal?
Well, the biggest problem we're seeing for global warming, so increasing temperatures for Arctic animals, is that as the warming's happening, the animals are trying to find a new home that's the same temperature as the home they used to have. Now, around the rest of the world, that means that animals are moving away from the equator and then moving towards the polar regions, because as the water warms, their old temperatures are now a little bit further north. Once you come up to the Arctic, and the same for the Antarctic, the animals have got nowhere to go. There's nowhere that is going to be colder than where they already are. So that's the biggest problem we have for animals at the moment.
Wow. And are there, maybe we can talk a little bit about polar bears, if possible. And I know that they're not your speciality. But it's for students to think about that if a polar bear gets too warm, then and if there's less sea ice, that's what you're talking about as well.
Exactly. Yes. So as well as the small things in the sea that I'm talking about, polar bears or Arctic foxes, anything like that. As the sea ice is disappearing, the polar bears are struggling to fish more and more, really. So
to get their seals and everything else for their food.
Exactly.
Have you? Here we go. There's questions about change.
Okay.
And I know that sort of you normally study change over a bit of a longer period of time, because you want to see whether it's a natural variation. Is that the right thing?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, just before we go for this question, what kind of sort of periods of time would you look at for something like ocean acidification and these longer term trends? It's not just year to year, is it?
No, some of these trends we're looking at over decades, if we can. You talking about? Do you mean experiments in the lab, or do you mean
experiments in the lab, or just generally? Because I think that certainly we could come here and say ocean acidification has changed by blah blah between last year and this year.
Yeah.
But that might be not representative of the whole.
So a lot of the time we're looking for trends over decades and decades. And for example, if you look at the temperature trends around the world, there's years where it might be warmer than the year before, and there's years where it might be colder than the year before. But if you look sequentially, there is an increase, a trend in increases. So we might come up this year and look at ocean acidification and find everything very acidic compared to what we were expecting. But next year, if the weather conditions throughout the year are very different, we might find that actually they're completely back to normal. But that doesn't mean things are okay. It just means that it takes a long time to see the trends that we're seeing. So yes, we talk about over decades or half centuries when we're looking at changes.
Because I wanted to contrast that with this question, which is looking at recent changes. Because we can, are there things anecdotally that you spotted and gone, that's just a bit odd?
Up here? Or?
And throughout any of your studies, I think.
Yes, certainly. There's I was doing some work in Australia just a few months ago, and there, Sydney Harbour, last year, they had a huge increase in temperature suddenly in a couple of weeks. So the temperature changed by, I think it's 7 or 9 degrees in 2 or 3 days. And that was a really odd occurrence. And looking at how the animals responded to that was really interesting, because that kind of gives an insight into how they might be able to respond in the future to changes.
Amazing, thank you. And then we're going to Manuela Corrier's E-Club members. So is there, we talked about ocean acidification and this gradual trend of the oceans becoming more acidic. They're wondering sort of if and how Arctic animals or Arctic species might adapt, or are they adapting to these changes?
Some are. We don't yet know. We don't completely understand how all the animals are going to adapt. We think a lot of the animals that have a hard shell around them, the shell will get thinner. It might get little holes in. For some animals, for example, some species of crab, what they're doing is they're concentrating their resources in the parts of the body they need it in. So if they need to use their claws for crushing prey so they can eat, or for collecting things to eat, they'll focus on calcifying their claws, and they'll put less calcium so that into their legs and their body, so their legs and body will be much thinner and not quite as hard, but their claws will be just as hard. So that seems to be how they're adapting at the moment.
And the second question is can they adapt that fast? And I think this is really looking at some of these environmental problems aren't problems necessary in the fact that change is occurring, but it's really the rate of change and how adaptation can keep pace with that.
That's right. So there is a rate of change. And again, this is something that scientists are trying to get a handle on and understand better at the moment. So what we find sometimes is over one generation, animals can adapt to that change. And it's called plasticity. So they have a range of acidity that they survive best in, but they can sometimes handle acidity at either end of the scale. So a bit less acidic and a bit more acidic. And what we find is if the parents have been exposed to one generation, then actually the offspring are dealing with that generation the change a little bit better than the previous generation. What we don't yet know is whether over multiple generations that change will continue, or whether after a few generations they'll start to struggle.
And I mean, and this is going to be a very odd question, but this is my personal interest. Yeah. That I've heard of scientists using flies to look at generations, very rapid generations, for some terrestrial questions.
That's right.
Is there a fly equivalent for marine science?
That is what every marine scientist has been hunting for since time began. No,
really?
We have not found. There are some small worms that you can use, which have quite a short generation time, but they're not the best species to look at sometimes for ocean acidification. So no, we're really struggling with that. I quite often work with sea urchins, and we have one species which we can reproduce, and the new sea urchins, the juveniles will develop to maturity, so where they're adults, in 6 months, and that's classed as fast.
That's classed as fast, because this is a question from Bucharest. Was you mentioned sea urchins, and they were wondering about some of the invertebrate species that you're currently studying. And did you pick sea urchins because they have that sort of faster sort of generation time, or is there another reason why you've picked them? There's
a few reasons. So one of the reasons I picked sea urchins is because they use calcium to build their outer shell. So they're a good species to look for to understand how ocean acidification impacts them. And the other is that they've got a really beautiful larval stage. So they kind of turn into almost a pyramid, or an inverted pyramid, really. Yes, when they're larvae, and there's lots and lots of different arms and body parts that you can measure, which are all impacted by ocean acidification, even when they're swimming larvae. So that gives us something great to look at.
Fantastic, thank you. I was going to switch to the live chat now, and just some questions here. Just a general question from Sri Lanka, from Wise International School. The temperature at the moment in the Arctic?
Ooh, it's around freezing. We had a lot of snow last night, so it is pretty chilly. I think around somewhere between -1 and 1 we've had.
Yeah, so in Fahrenheit, for those of our viewers who use Fahrenheit, that is about 30 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. That sounds very warm. If that doesn't sound sort of odd.
Well, we're heading towards the summer, so even up here, it gets a little bit warmer in the summer.
So summer sort of up to about 10 degrees Celsius. That's 50 Fahrenheit. But what kind of temperatures have you worked at down in Antarctica?
Down in Antarctica, I've worked down to about -15. So what's that in Fahrenheit?
This is a very good question. It's about 5 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
And so around sort of, going 20 is about 0, so towards 0. And how was that? I mean, especially working on a ship, because people sort of sometimes forget that you get very dry cold, often on sort of in the Arctic and Antarctic, where it's pretty well okay down to about -25 Celsius.
Yes.
But when you're on a ship, you've got that moisture and all the seawater and everything else.
You do, and you find as you're bringing equipment on deck, the seawater's freezing onto the cables as you're pulling it up. So you're handling chunks of ice as you're pulling all the things on board. Yeah, it can be pretty chilly. But the other great thing about a ship is you spend 10 minutes, maybe half an hour outside, but at any point you can quickly step inside. It's always about 2 or 3 steps to be back inside a warm lab. So it definitely feels colder in that damp, cold environment than it does in the dry cold that we have up here. But we survive.
We survive.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Lots of layers.
And this is a question coming through from the Children's International School in Lagos. Hello, Jamie and Casey. Please, what evidence of global warming have you been able to observe over the years?
Ooh, great question. I mean, what we're seeing really, one of the biggest pieces of evidence for global warming is the overall increases in temperature. So the ranges that you might see each year are increasing, and the sudden highs and the sudden lows are getting higher and lower. And what you need to remember about global warming is it doesn't just mean increases in temperature, it means changes, more variable temperatures. So we see warmer winters sometimes but colder summers, or you might get a real cold snap and followed by a real warm snap. Down in the Antarctic, we were looking at the king crabs, and the reason we were looking at those was because the temperatures down there have increased by about 1.5 degrees in some areas, and that's really allowing the crabs to move up and makes a big difference. But I think also speaking to people at the station here, they've noticed over the time they've been working here that this time of year is warmer than it was.
I mean, this is my third time in May, and this is definitely the warmest it's been. I mean, just some of the changes that have been observed in this area, in the Ålesund and Kongsfjorden, the glaciers at the back have retreated massively. I think they're retreating at about sort of 14 metres a year. We've got a headland opposite us. We say headland, but is now an island as the glaciers have retreated further up. And then, something like you would be able to have proper sea ice in the fjord just 15 years ago, and Nick, the station manager, talking about taking a tractor or skidoo out onto the fjord and travelling quite happily on the sea ice. I mean, we saw sea ice when we pointed out the head of the fjord when we were outside.
Yeah.
What was that sea ice like?
It's more like a slush puppy. I wouldn't like to try and walk on it, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, there's some, for people who've been here just for sort of 15, 20 years, some very, very observable changes in the environment and evidence of warming.
Yeah, and we've seen the same down in the Antarctic, where again, and what we thought was a headland close to the research station I was working at has suddenly become an island as the glaciers receded and receded. And also behind the research station we have what's called the backyard, where people go and hang out a bit when it's a little bit warmer or when the sun's out. And the backyard has grown and grown and grown over the last few decades as the ice extent has gone back.
Wow. I mean, so I think definitely if you have the privilege to come to the polar regions where some of this warming is occurring fastest, it's not just a theory. No. It's something that's very, very, very observable.
Yeah.
And really a sort of a follow-up question to that, and we have a lot of students from a lot of classes around the world who have been thinking about, well, two things. How do changes in the polar regions in the Arctic affect me? And then what can I do that can help the Arctic? Should we start with that first one?
Sure.
Why does what's happening in the Arctic, why does the study of ocean acidification up here matter to people around the world?
Well, what we're seeing up here is essentially an accelerated view of what we're seeing in the rest of the world. So it matters for that reason. With regard to warming, as the ice is melting here, sea level rise is increasing all over the world. So certain areas, Florida, for example, I think the predictions are that it's not going to be long before water levels really rise to impact.
And that's just to clarify that we have melting sea ice, and that doesn't affect the sea level rise, but we've got that melting sort of ice sheet on Greenland and the glaciers, and then the Antarctic ice sheet.
Yes.
It's the land ice melting that is
making the difference there. Yeah. And these are real sentinel areas. They're important areas to us where the Antarctic and the Arctic, the polar regions, haven't been impacted by humans in quite the same way as the rest of the world. So these are still areas we can come to really see what parts of the planet used to be like before human impact really hit things.
Brilliant. And then what can we do?
That's a great question.
I mean, we've got schools from all those different countries we introduced at the beginning, all of them not that close to the Arctic.
No.
Is there anything that you can do on a local level that helps this fairly remote and isolated place.
Absolutely. I mean, any of the changes that are being instilled around the world, really, with recycling or trying to cut energy use, trying to cut emissions, they all matter, because everything that we're doing in the rest of the world, a lot of the pollutants, for example, that we're producing come up into the atmosphere, and they flow towards the poles and end up in the polar region. So what we're doing at home continues to impact up here. The things we produce end up here in the atmosphere.
So anything we can do on a local basis
exactly
is going to benefit.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
We've got Xiju and Fuwei from XL Catlin in China are also watching, and they've got a bit more of a biographical question for you, Katie. Apparently you've been teaching biology in Uganda.
I did, yes, there's some good knowledge there.
Could you perhaps tell us more about this sort of experience, and especially of A, how did you end up in Uganda, and B, the switch in between research and teaching?
So I went out to Uganda. I wanted to, I didn't want to go straight to university after I finished my A-levels when I was 18 years old. So I looked at different things I could do, and I managed to find a company that would take me somewhere in the world to teach. So off I trotted to Uganda, being the only white person in town. Was really insightful, really interesting. And I went and worked in a secondary school there, teaching biology and maths. To kids all your age.
Fantastic. And how does that sort of experience of being a science educator informed how you approach your current job as a science researcher?
It really did affect how I approach things, because it taught me that you can get very caught up in the higher level, I guess. Once you reach a level of understanding, you forget that actually people who aren't studying your specific area will have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So it taught me the necessity and the benefits of really breaking down what I was doing to make sure it was easy for anybody in the world to understand, rather than just me sitting in my little bubble in my lab or in the Arctic. Yeah.
Because I mean, how big a part of your current job is outreach, and there's this term we give for speaking outside of the bubble.
Exactly.
Really.
Yeah. I do parts. I wish I could do more. There's certain criteria on my current funding which limits the amount of outreach I can do. Unfortunately, yes, there is. But just things like Twitter, trying to put anything that we do out on Twitter, getting involved in any speaking events I can. So we'll sometimes try and do events in local towns where we're just telling anybody who's interested in listening and coming to a talk on what we're doing, about what we're doing, things like that. Yeah.
Fantastic. This is. I mean, just to clarify, and I think we've got a couple of questions which we can look around. But you talk about specialisation in science, and so while students think you are the sort of the master of every single aspect of marine science, you end up specialising in quite sort of small areas.
You do, yes.
And then and then you collaborate with other people and then through that collaboration you can start to answer these sort of bigger questions.
Exactly. So while I might specialise on looking at how animals respond, there might be somebody else who is specialising on looking exactly how the properties change in the water column. So we might team together and go to one location, and they can look at the changes in the water column, and I can take their information and use the changes they're seeing to interpret how animals are going to respond to those changes.
And you might be studying sea urchins, and somebody might be studying other species.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Because I'm now going to land you on another species to see how we get on. And there's a couple of questions here, really looking at technology solutions to ocean acidification.
Okay.
We talk a lot about sort of mitigating the effects of climate change by slowing and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and that in turn slows and reduces the process of ocean acidification.
That's right, yes.
But GM, genetically modified coral.
Yes.
And we don't have to talk about coral necessarily, but is there talk of modifying invertebrates, whether it be coral or sea urchins or anything else, to cope better with the predicted changes that we're seeing in the ocean?
Great question. I have not seen anything looking at that. I've seen various things where people are talking about pumping down different additives to coral reefs and things to try and help them build. GM, I've not seen anything at all. I mean, one of the problems is you're playing a bit of a dangerous game with that. We have no idea how genetically modified species will interact with the current species that are there, whether they will impact them, wipe them out. You also, to a degree, it becomes a solution rather than stopping the cause.
You're addressing the symptoms.
Exactly. People start addressing the symptoms rather than addressing the cause of the problem.
Because it's another piece, and we've talked a little bit about geoengineering solutions to ocean acidification in some of the other calls. The big one is dumping, as far as I can remember, dumping vast quantities of iron filings in bits of the ocean.
Yep.
So this geoengineering is a technological solution to ocean acidification. Can you tell us the idea behind dumping iron filings in the ocean?
Good question. To be honest, I don't know much about it. I know they have been trying it for years. I know that there's not a huge amount of evidence suggesting
it's supposed to propagate sort of algal blooms or something like that. That's the
right,
It's
yes.
a bit like putting fertiliser on your garden.
Exactly. Yes. That's the idea. And I think they've gone to really low nutrient areas and tried dumping the iron to see if they can enhance algal blooms around those areas.
And then you get those algal blooms, and those are supposed to capture the carbon dioxide
Yes.
in the algae through photosynthesis, and that would stop the oceans having so much carbon dioxide and thus be less acidic.
Yes, and that's the theory behind it. But as I said, I personally have not read anything saying that this will work on a global scale. Perhaps on local scales it may help, but on a global scale, I myself have not seen anything.
And just following up from that, you talked about this, and I'm going to use a phrase, unintended consequences of using GM technology.
Yes.
What are potentially some of the unintended consequences of having huge algal blooms in the ocean?
Well, there's lots of potential. Huge algal blooms can reduce the amount of light going through the water, so other animals living in that area that are relying on the light for their own needs will no longer get it. There's the algal blooms. It depends on what species are blooming as to whether they are good for the animals living around there or not.
And we have this thing called dead zones, don't we? Coming up when we get algal blooms natural or through fertiliser, in fact, in coastal areas.
Yes.
Well, how does a dead zone occur?
Great question.
Because it's to do with, from what I can gather, there's this process, we get a lot of this fertiliser coming off from coastal areas. You get this massive amount of algae.
Yep.
That because you've got copepods and krill and all these little plankton that eat all the algae. But if it's too big, there aren't enough of these little to eat it all.
Yep.
That then dies, and the bacteria that consume that rotting matter then take the oxygen out of the water, and then there's this oxygenless
mess where nothing can live.
So, yes, there are potential geoengineering solutions to ocean acidification, but we've got no light, dead zones, and various other pieces as potential unintended consequences.
Yes, that's exactly, yeah.
So, the message coming from the Arctic is let's reduce our impact on the planet rather than trying to find these clever ideas.
Clever solutions, exactly, yeah. Number one, reduce the impacts.
Perfect. And this coming from China, they're talking about carbon capture and storage solutions, because it's a big problem in China. Apparently, this sort of excess carbon emissions. This is another example of using technology, and we've talked about a few at the moment. I mean, I suppose from a terrestrial point of view, and I know there are a lot of initiatives of, planting indigenous forests.
Yeah.
I mean, forests around the world and keeping the forests that we do have are amazing natural examples of carbon capture, and perhaps looking at those kinds of things rather than trying to have that quick fix.
Exactly. A long-term fix is always better than a quick fix. Yeah.
Perfect. We're very nearly at the end of our call. I'm sorry, Katie, for swerving around the marine world.
That's okay.
Very much away from your, from your sea urchins and areas of expertise. But as you can sort of tell, there's a very wide interest in the future of the oceans.
Yes.
And in undeniable importance to us, and the sort of uncertain future for the ocean, and therefore for the next generations growing up relying on it. What advice would you give to the young people watching about sort of developing as a sort of ocean literate citizen?
So understanding, you mean what's going on in the ocean?
Should we all go down to the sea and just connect a bit more?
Explore. Go rock pooling. Go and explore. There are so many people. I live close to the sea, and even where I live, there are people who live maybe 10 miles from the ocean that have never been there. And just go down and have a look around at low tide, especially because the networks and communities of animals down there are just incredible. And I think until you've been down to try and understand what's there, you have no idea. People think of it as just a giant bathtub, really, but there's whole communities and populations down there.
And just one last question before we end this call. Favourite marine animal?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'd probably have to go with humpback whales, but that's only because I've swum with them. So.
Wow! And so where was that?
That was in the middle of the Pacific when I was sailing across the Pacific about a decade ago, or whenever it was.
Amazing! What an incredible experience!
It was fantastic.
Can you just briefly describe how you felt in the water with a humpback?
Very enthralled, very excited, and a little bit terrified because they are huge. We had a mother and a calf, but even the calf is the size of 4 cows stuck together. So yeah, they were huge, and the calf kept trying to come up and say hello, and the mother wasn't too keen on that. So we swam for a while, snorkeled with them, and then got out and stayed in our boat. But they stayed with us for 2 days, which was just fantastic.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for answering all the questions that we've had submitted, those coming up on the live chat, and also the swerving questions for myself.
Yes.
So apologies for roaming all over the place. Thank you very much for watching. Do come back for our remaining 4 sessions today. We have in an hour an Ask Me Anything, an open Q&A, followed by an ocean acidification live investigation in 3 hours' time. 2 hours after that, another interview, this time timed for the North American audience, all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, and then a final open Q&A at 2000 hours Arctic time, which is, if I can work it out now, a bit earlier in the afternoon for the US. That's about as much as my maths can cope with. About 2 p.m. In the US. So thank you very much for watching, and it's a goodbye from Exile Kathryn Arctic Live until the next time.